Thank you. This paper is based on the book that Sally was so kind to show you in the leaflet. So it's when I'm saying we in this paper, it's not some kind of personality disorder or something. I'm referring to what Judith and I have been developing in the book. And since I'm not a native English speaker, I'll also be reading most of the paper. I hope you don't mind that I'll be reading this. And I don't have PowerPoint. It's not that I feel that I'm an old school philosopher or something, but I don't feel comfortable using PowerPoint, so I'll just be talking to. The paper is built up in two parts, and I'll first say something briefly about the actual ways in which we speak and talk about child rearing and the parent-child relationship. And I'll be focusing on the predominant languages, sort of explaining that. And secondly, in order to be able to explain what I mean in the abstract by this depoliticization of parenting today, we will need to start from a different conception of child rearing, one in which I try to reintroduce an element that I think has been relegated to the background in the predominant picture today, and that is an understanding of raising children as introducing children into a common world and the implications of that. So first of all, about these languages, how we speak and talk about child rearing today. The main concern that I want to address here is to show how our understanding, our conceptualization of parent-child relationships and of child rearing is claimed or has been claimed by certain languages and forms of reasoning, and especially what we focus on here will be the languages of psychology. Now, an important target here for our analysis is what we call the scientization of the parent-child relationship. And the scientization of the parent-child relationship actually shows itself in two aspects. In the languages of psychology on the one hand and what we call the discourse of professionalization. And I'll just briefly say something about this first. So first, it's hard to miss the ways in which we have predominantly come to conceptualize and speak about raising children, about the parent-child relationship, about what parents should be doing, and how they are expected to understand themselves and to relate to their children, that they are strongly informed by the languages of psychology, particularly by the languages of developmental psychology, behavioral psychology, and fairly recently, neuropsychology. All disciplines that have come to serve as a research base for identifying and defining, if only implicitly, what good parenting is. And I guess I don't need to explain this to you. There are many examples. Just look at the websites. We've just had a record from history about all these examples, websites, magazines. We just also need to be attentive to the actual ways in which we speak about child rearing. And we have this very specific vocabulary or jargon that is used in the media in a very self-evident way. And the expressions I think you're all familiar with are things like offering emotional support, enhancing well-being, accommodating children's needs, creating stimulating contexts, experimenting with taking distance from parents, enabling secure attachments, etc., etc. All these things that we use in a very self-evident way. Even children use them when talking about one another. Or just recently, I saw this very short interview with a colleague of mine in Ghent who analyzed swear words. Is it how you call it? How children insult swear words on the playground, and they're calling each other autistic. So that has become a swear word. So it's in our ordinary language now, and we use it. And children talk to one another. I have this, not in terms of I have this. I am this. So I am someone with ADHD, etc. And all these websites and magazines also have, as I think you know, presentations of developmental stages, explaining what children at a particular age should be doing or are doing. And while there is some variation in the description of these stages, the suggestion is almost always that these stages are universal, with the sense of universalism of the stages or phases heightened or epitomized in the usage of the word developmental milestones, suggesting that if a child misses one of these steps, she will most likely not be able to catch up. Now the second element of this scientization is what we would call the discourse of professionalization. Parents are expected to professionalize themselves in a certain sense. They are expected to keep themselves up to date with the latest scientific developments regarding good parenting, to prepare themselves for the job to come by reading the right books, attending parenting classes, participating in information evenings, etc. So actively seeking out information and advice. And we think that the very fact that we use the verb parenting for this is perhaps the most clear expression of this expectation to professionalization. Parenting is something you do. And the discourse of professionalization has also pervaded our ordinary language. The example of the children on the playground is one example. But it's even much more unnoticed there. For example, we talk about child rearing as a job or a task, and we talk about parenting skills. It's in the very ordinariness of our speaking, styles, approaches. All these words mark a particular kind of thinking about child rearing and parent-child relationship. And as you may well know, parenting now comes with a manual. That's the catchphrase for Triple P. Do you know Triple P? Triple P stands for Positive Parenting Program. It's this parenting support program that has been developed for about 10 years now by the Australian professor Matt Sanders, and it's been sort of distributed all over the world now. So parenting now comes with a manual. So all these words show that how we talk and think about this area of human life. Now the concern here is that we want to address is that by doing so we introduce a very narrow picture of child rearing, and this goes unnoticed, this narrow picture, because it goes under the flag of scientifically proven, of evidence-based, etc. Especially Triple P, for example. It's all evidence-based here, it's always evidence-based. And together with this narrow picture of child rearing, a whole set of assumptions, normative and otherwise, is introduced that is not addressed. And I will briefly mention 3 features of this narrow picture now. One feature is that child rearing is understood in terms of a linear developmental story, in which certain outcomes are implicitly posited as a desirable and ultimately achievable endpoint. And anything parents do along the way is understood as affecting the next step, and crucially, as taking us one step closer to reaching this endpoint. So, for example, when we read, we know the key principles of effective parenting. What is not asked is, effective at what? Behind such statements lies an account, whether explicit or not, of what the desirable outcome of parenting should be. Emotionally stable children, happy children, confident children, emotionally literate children, take your pick. And what we want to draw attention to is that this outcome has a particular and precise meaning that itself is defined from within the very same psychological discourse, rather than being the subject of a moral and cultural conversation. It is not even open to interpretations or questions, but is introduced almost imperceptibly with the language, as if it is self-evident. A second feature, and a particularly misleading one, is that this kind of language suggests that the day-to-day process of good parenting is only about the means, and that it has nothing to do with what parents found valuable or important. But in fact, again, a particular conception of the aims and values of child rearing is being introduced through the very language of this discourse. Apart from the very idea itself that child rearing should have outcomes, the important questions are, what do concepts like emotionally stable mean? Stable as against what? Why do we value emotional stability, or similarly, confidence and happiness above other aims? Even apparently neutral terms like mental health, which we've all seen now, which appear in child rearing advice books at least as far back to the 1930s or 20s, are now given a very specific meaning within a culture of quantifiable measurements of levels of self-esteem, anxiety, personality types, and so on. Thirdly, the final feature I want to talk to here is that perhaps testifies most clearly to this narrow picture of child rearing, is that our understanding here is generally confined to seeing child rearing as something that takes place in the one-to-one interaction between parent, usually the mother, and child. So what seems to have become dominant is a picture of child rearing as being a micro-world of interactions, with the implication that the important thing that parents should be doing is, and I'm quoting Derbyshire here, micromanaging that relational setting. This is particularly worrisome because it has far-reaching implications for how we have come to understand the notion of parental responsibility, for example. The scientization of child rearing and the parent-child relationship leads to a very impoverished and instrumental understanding of what parental responsibility is. What follows from the current predominant conceptualization, the language, is that parents are held responsible for creating a particular kind of child and for a particular kind of process. They're held responsible for ensuring the optimal conditions for growth for their children and for maintaining a firm grip on this developmental process. Parental responsibility, in this sense, is defined narrowly in terms of the needs of the child, which are then largely determined by scientific research in psychology. Responsible parents are, on this view, parents who in the first place are concerned about the child's proper development and who are willing to do whatever is necessary, including learning whatever is needed in this area, to ensure this optimal development, the development of the child's capabilities, talents, etc. Now, given this narrow picture, we would argue that it is not much of a surprise that the relation between the family and child rearing on the one hand and society at large at the other hand, so between, that is, the private sphere of the family and the public sphere of our society, is also being conceived of in terms far too narrow. That is, it's only a small step from this conceptualization of child rearing to the idea that parents can be expected to make or to produce the next generation of citizens. And I guess I don't have to give examples here. I mean, given the recent events here and the policy discourse on that. It is as if by a peculiar case of odd reasoning, it is considered possible to somehow isolate the process of raising children, analogously to the production process of something, and as if the family is taken to be some kind of factory in which the next generation of good citizens is fabricated. Now, as we have seen also, there's a very good documentation we just had in the previous presentation. The family, child rearing have often and perhaps always been of interest to policymakers and powerful interest groups. But there is also a good case to make that the current proliferation of advice, manuals, classes, literature, and TV programs aimed at parents is maybe unlike anything ever seen in human history, and that it goes hand in hand with an unprecedented burgeoning of policy initiatives in the area of families and parents. And the way in which, now in this way in which policymakers address parents and claim the field of parenting has been rightly criticized by a good many of people. And thus, for example, Val Gillies rightly points to what she calls, and I quote Gillies here, the political association between parenting and social ills, arguing that wider issues of poverty and injustice are sidelined through the construction of a culturally distinct minority of parents as the major focus of concern. And perhaps the most straightforward of these criticisms is probably, and I think you're familiar with, is the one articulated by Professor Ferretti. According to Ferretti, within current political circles, the idea is that all forms of antisocial behavior, crime, drugs, teenage pregnancy, illiteracy, and poverty have been linked to incompetent parenting, end quote. And this is based upon an uncritical acceptance of what he calls the ideology of parental determinism. That is the ideology that parenting determines the behavior of children. And within a climate of moral malaise, he argues that quick fix solutions are needed. And as he puts it, parents provide an ideal target for those seeking a ready-made one. And he rightly criticizes, we think, this kind of politics as opportunistic. And he sees the politicization of parenting as an outcome of the failure of political imagination. Now, we agree with the diagnosis of the situation, and especially with the critique that what lies behind this mobilization of parents is, again in Gillies' words, a value-laden vision of how responsible, competent parents should behave. Now, the problem, however, is that what this critique seems to leave out of the picture is the idea that the family itself is characterized by a political dimension in its own right. And it is to this issue now that I will turn. So that's the second part, finish the first part now. It's the second part about the politicization of what we call the politicization and the depoliticization. Now, first of all, I think we need to acknowledge, and this is obvious in a sense, that there are different definitions in play here of what political is and what politics means. And one way of putting this difference is by saying that the use of the term political by critics such as those just mentioned is a use that points out the negative aspects of policy, hence also the concept politicization. Politicians claiming this particular arena of human existence and turning it into an instrument for their own use. It is using parenting for their own political ideas or agenda. Now, in distinction from this, we want to propose to use the term political in terms of the recognition of the fact that what is always involved in child rearing are conceptions of what it means to live together with other people. Child rearing is political in this sense, since children are being introduced into a common world. Raising children is always already political, in the sense that children are brought up by parents who convey to them, and are brought up in sociocultural settings which convey to them particular conceptions of what it means to live together with other people and of what it means to organize living together with other people. Put differently, child rearing has a public orientation, not in the sense that parents are responsible for producing future members of the public, but in the sense that they are from the outset helping children to insert themselves into the world, and therefore it can be called political. Now, maybe you're thinking, not sure, but maybe you think this is just conceptual quibbling, but it isn't. It's not just one definition against another. Rather, we think it is a recognition of the fact that what parents do when they are raising their children has a societal dimension that goes far beyond a narrow understanding of it in terms of delivering well-behaved citizens. It is a recognition, or maybe we should say in current times, a recollection of the fact that parents also represent some world, that they have to pass on that world to their children, and also that they cannot exert final or absolute control over this process, since the entire process is imbued with moral and political judgment and values, the meaning of which their children partly have to interpret and reconstruct for themselves. Now, to this conception of political, we want to add a further and crucial dimension. Now, I started this paper by raising some comments and critiques of the scientization of parenting. And what is lacking in these languages of parenting today is, as suggested, a recognition of an inevitable backdrop of evaluative judgments. Put differently, we could say that parents are made to look at their children and act accordingly through what we could call a third-person perspective. And this is the perspective that says parents should, children are, children should be doing. Importantly, what we think is ignored here is what we would call the first-person perspective. This is not just pointing to the importance of context or a reminder of the fact that individual children and individual parents are different, but it points to the significance of the fact that for the parent, any judgment about what to do in particular situations with their child is inseparable from the fact that it is their child, it is my child. And an example here might clarify this a bit further. And I take an example which I think some of you might be familiar with. Consider or just imagine your 18-month-old baby screaming in the supermarket aisle. Now, this presents a problem, not just because the parent wants to effectively stop the screaming, but because the parent may want all sorts of other, possibly conflicting things. She may want the child to be a certain way and may want to be a certain kind of parent. She may want her child not to be the kind of child who has tantrums whenever she is unhappy or frustrated. She may want her to be able to ask for what she wants without screaming. She may want to feel in control. She may want to be able to calm down her child without feeling she is controlling her or repressing her individuality. She may want her to be assertive. She may want to be able to model sensitivity. She may want to be thought of as a good mother. She may want reassurance that the child loves her, etc. The list is, we think, quite literally endless and not necessarily consciously articulated. Any of these desires and perceptions, or a combination of them, could be going through any parent's mind at any given moment with their child who is behaving in a way that demands a response. To explore them, to identify what ideas, values, and motivations are behind them, which of them are in tension with others, which seem more important to the parent and why, requires an attention to the meaning of the terms in which we describe and think about what we do with and for our children. This kind of thinking, though, cannot be done independently or in advance of the relational experience of particular moments of the parent-child interaction, nor, to connect this to what I said in the beginning about the public dimension of child rearing, nor can it go into a vacuum in the parent-child diet functions in a manner divorced from all social, moral, and political values and judgments. Now, it is precisely this kind of practical reflection and response that is blocked by the dominance of the scientific language, imposing as a neutral and independently valid account of what children need, or which developmental goals are most important, without acknowledging that these goals reflect evaluative choices. The science of parenting obscures the point that all aspects of the process in question are infused with values and interpretation. What the scientific account asks parents to do, in other words, is to see their child as a child, and thus to bracket out the specific commitments and understandings that they have about how they want to be as a person in their relationship with their individual child. Thus, to bracket out, in one word, this first-person perspective. Now, to the extent that reflections and considerations of this kind are blocked, and to the extent that it is no longer recognized that parents are always representing some world, since, as suggested, the focus lies exclusively on micromanaging interactions and stuff. Now, what this in fact then comes down to is a depoliticization of the family and child rearing. Parents, that is, within the current dominant language of parenting, are no longer allowed to be moral agents in a rich sense of the word. And here we understand agent not as in agency, which means something like a person's subjective sense of being the author of her deeds, but as closely related to what the German-American philosopher Hannah Arendt calls action. For Hannah Arendt, a human being inserts herself into the world through speech and action. And just one brief quote from Arendt here. In acting and speaking, men show who they are, reveal actively their unique personal identities, and thus make their appearance in the human world. Now, this needs to be elaborated a lot more, but I can't do that right here. Just you have to take my word for it. Now, in the current parenting culture, with its emphasis on styles, approaches, safe attachments, manuals, etc., the focus is on parents' agency in the narrow sense. Parenting is compartmentalized into manageable steps and parts, all of which are supposedly backed up by scientific research. Toilet training, eating behavior, emotional training, developing attachment, etc. And all of which are meant to help parents to gain a certain control over their child's behavior and accordingly to enhance their own sense of agency. Now, in contrast to this, our emphasis on the inevitability of an evaluative and moral background against which parents have to operate alerts us to the fact that what is at stake is not parents' agency, but the very idea of parents as moral agents, as beings who cannot, in the words of another philosopher, Sheila Ben-Habib, so as beings who cannot withdraw from moral judgments on pain of ceasing to interact, to talk, and to act in the human community. Whatever it is that parents do in the process of child rearing, even if that is something like enabling their children to experiment with taking a safe distance or whatever, this always involves judgments and values, and these decisions made by parents always, or at least always potentially, involve tensions due to the competing frameworks of judgments and values. Now, the real threat posed by the scientization of the language of parenting to our understanding of what this is that it reduces the experience of being the parent of one's own child to a more or less coherent and unified account that presents itself as the correct way of raising children, and in so doing diminishes parents' capacity and range for action in the Arendtian sense identified. Now, in trying in this sense to reclaim parenting as a political realm, we also want to raise questions about the solution proposed by critics who bemoan the current politicization of parenting, namely that we, for example, should leave parents to their own devices or let parents be parents, or try restoring some sense of trust in one's instincts. These proposals all seem to advocate a return to some kind of naturalness of the bond between parent and child, or to some unperverted set of practices that make up parenting. This is problematic, we think, because, first of all, it seems to ignore, in a way very similar to this expert discourse, the fact that parents have to make, and are always already making, decisions against a backdrop of moral and political evaluations and judgments. And alongside this, in an important sense, it also effectuates exactly the same kind of result as that of an all-too-easy policy vision, namely, it disempowers parents, or put more precisely, it strips child rearing of its potential for offering political experiences. It strips the family of the possibility of being a space that has a public orientation. Now, to conclude, where does this leave us? We have no ready-made answers here, but the only thing I think I want to say at this point is that we do think that there are ways of offering help and support to parents, and that the challenge is to think about shaping these ways of offering help and support that would acknowledge and value what we would call this first-person perspective, and that thus would perhaps be more meaningful for parents, and ways of offering help and support that would give back to the practice of child rearing its value of being a practice that has a societal public orientation, other than the one understood in terms of producing future members of someone else's envisioned brave new world. Thank you.